Virginia, 1860. The night sky glowed red above the plantation, not from lanterns or moonlight, but from fire. A woman, enslaved yet unbroken, had done the unthinkable. She set the master's house ablaze, choosing flames over chains. To her, this wasn't just destruction, it was liberation. What kind of courage does it take to risk everything, not for yourself alone, but for the freedom of your people? This is the story of one act of defiance that turned a plantation into a battlefield for justice. If hidden stories like this captivate you, hit like, subscribe, and share, so more people can uncover the parts of history they were never taught. Chapter 1. The World of Virginia. 1860 Virginia in 1860 was a land balanced on the edge of war, its fields heavy with tobacco and cotton, its wealth built on bondage. The state was home to one of the largest enslaved populations in America. For those enslaved, life was measured not in years, but in endless days of labor, sunrise to sunset, under the constant watch of overseers. The plantations looked orderly from a distance, grand houses, sprawling fields, but behind the facade was a system of fear, violence, and control. Enslaved men and women endured lives of relentless toil. Some worked in the fields, bent over rows of crops until their backs ached. Others worked in kitchens, blacksmith shops, or stables. Children were put to work as soon as they could walk, their futures sealed before they could dream. Families lived under constant threat of being torn apart, sold off to settle debts, or shipped south as punishment. At night, cabins filled with whispered prayers and soft songs, where hope survived in fragments. But beneath the cruelty, resistance simmered. Virginia had already been shaped by rebellion. Nat Turner's uprising in 1831 still haunted white slaveholders, a memory that hardened their paranoia. In response, laws grew stricter, punishments harsher, and freedom seemed more distant than ever. Yet the memory of Turner and of countless unnamed acts of defiance lingered like an ember in the dark. By 1860, the nation itself was fracturing. The debate over slavery was pushing the United States toward civil war, and Virginia stood at the heart of it. For those trapped in bondage, the air felt charged with both danger and possibility. In this volatile landscape, one woman would choose fire as her answer, striking a blow that carried far beyond the walls of her plantation. Chapter 2. The woman behind the fire history rarely records her name. That silence is telling. Enslaved women like her lived, struggled, and sometimes fought back, yet their identities were often erased, leaving only fragments of their courage behind. What we know is shaped by whispers in old records, scraps of testimony, and the oral traditions passed down through descendants. But while her name may have been lost, her act of defiance burned itself into memory. She was an enslaved woman in Virginia in 1860, forced into a world that denied her ownership of even her own body. She likely lived in a cramped wooden cabin, cooked meals she could barely eat, and raised children who could be sold away at any moment. Her days were controlled by the master's orders, the overseer's whip, and a system designed to crush spirit as well as body. But her silence was not consent, it was survival. For women in bondage, the burdens were doubled. They carried the physical labor of the fields and the private torments of exploitation inside the house. Yet they were also the keepers of culture, passing down songs, stories, and resilience. Within that role lay a quiet strength, one that slaveholders underestimated again and again. What might have pushed her toward fire? Was it the grief of a child sold away? The lash across her back for a task done too slowly? Or simply the realization that chains would never break unless someone dared to strike? We cannot know the precise spark, but we know this. She turned her despair into defiance. When she set the plantation ablaze, she wasn't just burning wood and brick. She was shattering the illusion that slavery could ever tame the human will. Her fire was her name, etched into history. Chapter 3. Life on the plantation. To understand the weight of her decision, you have to picture the world she lived in day after day. Plantations in Virginia were not the romantic estates that old paintings suggest. They were prisons without walls, designed to look orderly, yet powered by brutality. At sunrise, the fields filled with movement. Enslaved men, women, and children walked in lines, carrying hoes and baskets, their eyes heavy with exhaustion from too little rest. Overseers rode on horseback, whips coiled at their sides, reminding everyone that mistakes, or simply slowing down, would be met with pain. Even meals were not moments of freedom. Food was meager: cornmeal, salt pork, beans if they were lucky. Enough to keep people alive, never enough to nourish them. Inside the big house, others worked as cooks, maids, or personal attendants. That life might seem easier, but it carried its own dangers. Domestic enslaved workers lived under the master's constant gaze, vulnerable to humiliation, exploitation, and abuse. The line between labor and servitude blurred into something far more invasive. Families were fragile. Marriage had no legal standing. Children could be sold as easily as livestock. Imagine tucking your child into bed knowing they might not be there tomorrow. The sound of an auctioneer's hammer was a terror that hung over every home. And yet, even in this controlled world, enslaved people carved out small spaces of humanity. At night, songs rose from the cabins, melodies that carried both sorrow and strength. Stories of Africa, whispered prayers, and coded tales of deliverance kept hope alive. These acts of culture were resistance in themselves, tiny rebellions against the system that tried to erase them. This was the world she walked through daily. A world that demanded obedience, but instead bred quiet defiance, and eventually, fire. Chapter 4. Whispers of rebellion. Rebellion rarely began with shouts. It started in whispers. On Virginia plantations, enslaved men and women passed messages in songs, in coded Bible verses, in stories that seemed innocent but carried deeper meanings. A simple line in a hymn, "Steal away to Jesus," wasn't just about heaven. It hinted at escape, at breaking chains, at a future beyond the fields. These hidden networks were survival itself. Talking openly about resistance meant certain punishment, but silence never meant submission. In the kitchens, in the fields, and at the water wells, people exchanged fragments of news, rumors of uprisings in other counties, stories of fugitives who reached the north, even scraps of abolitionist newspapers smuggled in by sympathetic hands. Knowledge traveled faster than slaveholders imagined. Virginia was haunted by memories of Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. The white population responded with paranoia, convinced another uprising could erupt at any moment. That fear forced enslaved people to be cautious, but it also revealed a truth. The system was brittle. Slaveholders built their lives on control, yet lived in constant dread that control could collapse overnight. For women especially, rebellion often took different forms. Some refused to bear children for their masters. Some sabotaged meals or tools. Others spread information, becoming the quiet backbone of resistance. The plantation was a battlefield disguised as farmland, and every act of defiance, big or small, was a skirmish. In that climate, whispers carried power. They planted ideas that grew into courage. Our unnamed woman in Virginia must have felt them echo around her. The knowledge that others had fought back, that fire could burn more than timber. It could burn fear into the hearts of those who believed themselves untouchable. And one night, whispers would become flames. Chapter 5. The spark of defiance. Every act of rebellion begins with a moment, an instant when fear gives way to fury, when patience breaks, and silence can no longer hold back the storm. For the enslaved woman in Virginia, that moment must have come after years of carrying pain that was too heavy to bear. Perhaps it was personal. Maybe she had seen a child sold away, the kind of wound that never healed. Maybe she endured cruelty at the hands of an overseer or the master himself. Or perhaps she watched her community, her family in every sense, ground down day after day and realized that survival alone was not enough. Whatever the trigger, it wasn't sudden rage. It was the slow burn of injustice that finally caught fire. Defiance in that world meant certain risk. Punishments were brutal, and reprisals often swept across entire communities. To plan an act as dangerous as burning the plantation required both courage and calculation. She would have needed to move in silence, gathering fuel, finding the right moment, knowing who might help and who might betray. Every step closer to that night carried the weight of life or death, but she must have understood something powerful. Fear was already their daily reality. To live enslaved was to live with violence, separation, and the constant threat of loss. By striking back, she was not creating danger. She was seizing control of it. The spark of defiance was not born in madness. It was born in clarity, the recognition that freedom would never be given, only taken. That clarity set her resolve. And when the moment came, she chose fire, not as destruction alone, but as a weapon, a message, and a desperate bid for liberation. A desperate bid for liberation. Chapter 6. The Night of Flames. The night was quiet at first, the kind of heavy silence that pressed down on the cabins and fields. The overseer's lanterns had gone dark, and the house on the hill stood like a monument to power, glowing faintly under the moon. It was in that silence that she moved, steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of a choice that could never be undone. Fire begins small. A spark, a flicker. Maybe it was a torch pressed to dry timber, or embers slipped into straw. However it started, the flame caught quickly. Soon, smoke curled upward, dark and sharp against the night sky. Then came the crackle, the roar, the sudden burst of heat that turned wood into tinder and walls into collapsing skeletons. The big house, built as a symbol of wealth and permanence, was never as invincible as it seemed. Curtains ignited, beams groaned, glass shattered. Flames licked higher, spreading from room to room until the plantation's heart was engulfed. For the enslaved, who watched from the shadows, it must have been a vision both terrifying and exhilarating. The master's world unraveling in fire. Panic tore through the household. The master, his family, perhaps even overseers, scrambled into the night, faces lit by the inferno. Shouts mixed with the cries of livestock, the chaos of a system unraveling in real time. And amid that chaos stood the enslaved woman who had struck the match, watching a world that claimed to own her crumble into ash. That night, the flames did more than destroy a house. They shattered the illusion that the plantation was unbreakable. For one brief, blazing moment, power shifted, and the enslaved knew it. The fire was both vengeance and a promise. Slavery could burn. Chapter 7. The aftermath. By dawn, the plantation was a ruin. Charred beams jutted out like broken bones, smoke drifted across the fields, and the air still carried the acrid sting of ash. What had once stood as a monument to wealth and control was now little more than smoldering rubble. But destruction was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of consequence. For the enslaved community, the aftermath was a storm of fear and uncertainty. Slaveholders across Virginia reacted with swift brutality whenever resistance surfaced. Whippings, hangings, and mass punishments were used not just on the guilty, but on anyone nearby, as a reminder of what happens when defiance sparks. Entire groups could be punished for the act of one, because the system thrived on terror more than justice. It's likely that neighbors rode in to assist, bringing with them suspicion and weapons. Local authorities would have demanded answers, trying to root out who had started the blaze. But here's where solidarity mattered. Silence could be protection. Enslaved communities often shielded those who resisted, telling nothing, even under pressure. Because to betray one was to betray the fragile hope they all carried. For the master and his family, the fire was more than financial ruin. It was humiliation. To them, it proved that their control was not absolute. That realization bred fear, and fear hardened into cruelty. New restrictions, harsher rules, and increased surveillance often followed acts like these. And yet, something had changed. The fire could not be undone, and its memory lingered. For those in bondage, it was proof that the plantation was not untouchable. Even if punishment followed, even if lives were lost, the act itself became a spark in the collective imagination. Resistance was possible, and the system could bleed. Chapter 8. The Fear of Slaveholders. Slaveholders lived in a constant state of paranoia, and the fire on that Virginia plantation only deepened their dread. Beneath their polished manners and outward confidence, they knew the truth. They were outnumbered. In Virginia alone, nearly 500,000 people lived in bondage. If those people rose together, no amount of whips or guns could hold them down. The fire was a reminder of just how thin the line of control really was. To the enslavers, each act of defiance felt like a crack in the foundation of their world. Nat Turner's rebellion nearly 3 decades earlier had already left scars of fear, and every new uprising, whether large or small, made those wounds ache again. A single torch in the night could send ripples across the South, stirring panic among families who slept uneasy in their plantation homes. In response, laws grew harsher. Slave patrols tightened their grip, curfews were enforced, and even the smallest gatherings of enslaved people were treated as threats. Preachers were watched, songs were censored, and reading or writing was outlawed for the enslaved, because knowledge meant power, and power meant danger. The fire reminded masters that the enslaved were not passive property, but human beings with anger, hope, and courage. What's striking is how fragile the so-called masters really were. They projected dominance, but their wealth depended on fear, working like an invisible chain. And when that fear broke, when someone dared to resist, the illusion shattered. The woman who burned the plantation forced them to face their own nightmare. That one act of rebellion could inspire 100 more. For the enslaved, their fear was a weapon. Every flicker of rebellion planted doubt in the minds of those who believed themselves untouchable. Doubt that fire could strike again. Chapter 9. The Wider Struggle. The fire in Virginia was not an isolated spark. It was part of a much larger blaze smoldering across the South. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, some subtle, others explosive. Each act, whether breaking a tool, slowing the pace in the fields, escaping north, or burning a plantation, was a thread in the wider fabric of struggle. Together they formed a quiet war against bondage. By 1860, that war was tightening. The Underground Railroad was carrying fugitives north, aided by abolitionists who risked prison and violence to help them. Newspapers in the North printed accounts of slavery's brutality, fueling debates that grew louder in Congress. And in the South, every rumor of resistance magnified the tension between freedom and oppression, pushing the country closer to collapse. For enslaved women, the struggle had its own dimension. They resisted not only through physical acts, but through cultural survival, teaching songs, preserving names, passing down stories of Africa and freedom. To raise a child with hope, to maintain dignity under dehumanization, was its own form of rebellion. But when some women chose open defiance, through poison, arson, or escape, they struck at the very heart of the system. The Virginia fire was one act among many, but it carried symbolic weight. It showed that resistance could erupt anywhere, at any time, from anyone. And each act of defiance spread unease among slaveholders, reminding them that no plantation was truly safe. As the nation itself fractured, stories like this revealed the truth. Slavery was not a stable institution. It was a powder keg, kept in place only by violence, fear, and lies. And when enough sparks caught, through rebellion, escape, or war, the system itself would finally burn. Chapter 10. Legacy of Fire. The flames that consumed that Virginia plantation in 1860 may have died out by morning, but their legacy never did. They carried forward as a symbol of resistance, proof that even in the darkest conditions, the human spirit will fight for freedom. Though her name may be lost, the woman who lit that fire etched herself into history by reminding the world that slavery could not erase courage. Stories like hers challenged the myths that once softened the image of slavery. For too long, textbooks and plantation tours painted it as an institution rather than the brutal system it was. But one fire tells the truth more clearly than 1,000 records. It was not peaceful. It was not accepted. It was contested every single day by the people forced to endure it. Her act belongs to a broader legacy, one that stretches from whispered songs in slave cabins to uprisings across the South, to the long fight for civil rights a century later. Each spark of defiance passed into the next generation, becoming part of a chain of resistance that still shapes the present. And today, her story raises questions for us. How many acts of courage remain hidden, unnamed, erased from official records? How many women and men risked everything only for history to forget them? By remembering this one act of fire, we honor not just her, but all those whose bravery flickered in the shadows. The plantation she burned may be gone, but the meaning endures. Freedom is never handed down. It is seized. And sometimes it is seized in fire. And sometimes it is seized in fire.